Hi, this is Caleb Cain, and you're watching Cain Course World. Harry Truman, Doris Day, Red China and Johnny Ray, South Pacific, Walter Winchell, Joe DiMaggio, Joe McCarthy, Richard Nixon, Studebaker Television, North Korea, South Korea, Marilyn Monroe. We didn't start the fire. Yeah, you either just recognize one of the greatest Billy Joel songs of all time or that scene from The Office where Ryan started the fire with his cheesy pita. Yeah, whichever one it is, it's great for what we're talking about today, which is contextualizing Unit 9 of AP World History, and that is everything that happens truly in the 21st century. Billy Joel's We Didn't Start the Fire is one of the greatest songs of all time, and what it does is it capitalizes on the events of world history from the end of World War II all the way up until the 1990s. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to dive into the events that give us background into Unit 9 of AP World History. Contextualization, again, is the skill of figuring out what are the events that happen within the background of what our main focus is. And our focus in Unit 9 is going to be on globalization, or the world coming together. And we're going to pick up where we left off in context with the Cold War in about 1980 or so. Remember, there was so much that happened with the Cold War that has changed the way that the world functions. But now we're looking at a world that is definitely more connected than ever. And our starting point for this is the presidency of Ronald Reagan in 1980. This is where we truly see the de-escalation of the Cold War start to begin. A lot of that was because Reagan threw a lot of U.S. spending at not only stimulating the economy, but building up a military and a defense system capable of protecting the United States from potential Russian invasions. Now, when it comes to pop culture, the world is really changing at this time. And a great example of that is MTV, something that's not as popular as it used to be, but music television, where basically they would just play music videos all day. This really gave the 80s its life when it came to music and pop culture, and also changed the way we looked at the media. It really created a more hands-on, visceral experience when it came to music, and allows all these different types of music to get into people's homes, because we also have people that are having TVs in their homes for the first time. Now, worldwide, however, we are continuing to see the use of terrorism. Another example of this is the Beirut bombings in Lebanon, where U.S. and French soldiers had been stationed by the UN to try to keep the peace in Lebanon, which was a hotly contested area in the Middle East, was bombed by suicide bombers. And we're starting again to see that the Middle East especially is not very open to Western involvement. And it's another reflection of this growing trend of the use of terrorism for marginalized groups or underappreciated groups to make a message worldwide. 1985, however, is really the major turning point, because we see a change in the Soviet Union, and that's the election of Mikhail Gorbachev, who will introduce several different types of politics that hadn't been used in the Soviet Union in a long time, which included some capitalist ideas when it came to industrialism and spending, and a little bit more of an open participation in the UN and relationships with people like the United States. In 1985, we also see the continued effects of a growing music and pop culture industry with the Live Aid concert, which really showed the effect that music could have on the world. Live Aid was meant to bring attention to some of the issues going on in Africa, especially with the food crisis going on. And here you can see Freddie Mercury of Queen performing one of the most famous concerts of all time. And again, it just shows how important music is becoming, and that the world is changing as people are desiring more and more entertainment. Now, Reagan's presidency is also interesting as well, because he does have some questionable things that go on. Again, the dirty tricks boys getting a little bit too overextended. This specifically happens with something called the Iran-Contra affair, which becomes public knowledge in 1986. Essentially, members of Reagan's cabinet had bought and sold weapons with Iran and had used those funds to then back a capitalist group in Nicaragua called the Contras, and it was this real mess. And Reagan claimed he didn't know anything about it, which was a question about presidential power and whether or not Reagan had extended. Was he telling the truth or not? But as we're going to see later on, this is one of the smaller issues presidents in the 80s and 90s have in regards to their power. 1986, we see some disasters as well. The Challenger disaster, a U.S. space shuttle that exploded during takeoff in the atmosphere, was a worldwide broadcast tragedy. And on top of that, in Russia, we have the Chernobyl disaster, where a nuclear power plant reacted and blew up and killed a number of people, as well as leaving that area cursed basically with the effects of nuclear radiation. In addition to that, worldwide, we continue to see more tensions between different people as people are becoming more and more connected. In Israel, we have what is called the First Intifada. It was basically an organized protest and violence between people who were advocating for a new Palestine and people who were advocating for the continuation of the Israeli state. It's acts of terror, acts of violence, acts of riots that, again, are bringing more worldwide focus into the incidents going on in Israel at this time. However, 1988 is where we truly see the end of the Cold War. That's where Gorbachev and the Soviet Union embraced this idea of perestroika, moving back to some more capitalist tendencies and away from the communist situation that Stalin had set up, and allows Russia to start to grow out of this economic rut that they were in. In 1988, we also see a change in the presidency. After serving 2 terms, Ronald Reagan is replaced by his vice president, George H.W. Bush, who will try to continue the Reagan administration in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of similarities there, but there's also some differences in what ends up happening with the status of the United States in this new global culture. It's during that presidency that in 1989, the Berlin Wall, which Reagan had called for being torn down in 1987, was finally torn down and kind of marks the end officially of the Cold War. It's in that same year that the Soviet Union will crumble and it will become an independent state called Russia. And the issues that we had in the Cold War are pretty much over for the foreseeable future. But now we're moving into the 90s and the 2000s, where so much of the world is, again, trying to pick up the pieces of what was the Cold War, much like what we saw with World War II. And an example of this happens in China and what's now known as the Tiananmen Square massacre, where students had been protesting the communist regime that was starting to use some martial law type actions within its government. Here you can see one individual who tried to protest the tanks that were being sent in to deal with this student rally. And it again shows that there's still people trying to react to communism and the changes going on worldwide. In 1989, we also start to see a change in the way that technology is used and the resources are used. And some of that is more of an awareness to how our new technology is affecting the environment. The event that really turns the corner for this is the Exxon Valdez oil spill, which happened in 1989. You can just see it by the picture there, the destruction that this potentially caused to our ocean. People begin to question whether or not the technology we have, if that's actually beneficial for the environment. There's a social awareness that we have to take care of the environment that we haven't had before. 1990 is another turning point because the internet is officially invented. The World Wide Web, specifically the web browser that allowed for you to search for things at the tip of a finger. And that's going to cause computers to obviously be more widespread and popular, and allows an access to information that we've never had before. But 1991 is a very important year because that includes the Gulf War. The United States, along with some other members of the UN, got involved in a regional conflict that happened specifically around the relatively new country of Kuwait, which had been essentially attacked by other Middle Eastern countries, including Egypt and Syria and Iraq, especially under the reign of Saddam Hussein, for its oil. And in Operation Desert Storm, the U.S. got heavily involved through quick tank strikes and aerial bombings that allowed the United States to sort of bring this Gulf War to an end. But it shows that there's now going to be a U.S. involvement in the Middle East that there hasn't been before. And a lot of that is tied to oil. As the 90s continue, we see the election of Bill Clinton, who was radically different from George H.W. Bush. He was a man of the people in a lot of ways, and he was kind of hip and popular. I mean, he went on Arsenio Hall show and played his saxophone. He was famous because of the way he connected with people. And it's during his presidency that we see a lot of other changes in the United States as it continues to try to be this police force around the world. One example of this is the war going on in what is now Bosnia. This had to do with the breaking up of Yugoslavia after the fall of the Soviet Union. There's a lot of people jockeying for position in new independent states with the new chance to rule themselves. In 1993, Clinton tries to create peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians in the PLO. You can see him there with Yitzhak Rabin of Israel and Yasser Arafat of the PLO. And at the Oslo Accords of 1993, it looked like we had steps towards peace between these two sides. But 1993 is a major year in Clinton's presidency because the World Trade Centers, yes, those same World Trade Centers, were bombed by terrorists. And it's not the first time that that'll happen, but it begins to show this disregard for the United States and this dislike of their involvement worldwide. And marginalized groups are going to start to strike back towards the United States. Worldwide, we also see the changes in new decolonized states like South Africa, where Nelson Mandela becomes the first president of this new South Africa, which had just ended a policy of apartheid, which is a complete split between races. And we're starting to see, again, global culture spread in a way where democracy is the winning outcome in most of these new countries. 1995 gives us another example of terrorism, this time on U.S. soil by Americans. Timothy McVeigh and a friend bombed the Oklahoma City Capitol building, well, one of the municipal buildings, and in doing so showed again the prevalence of terrorism. In 1995, we also see the U.S. and the UN come together to end the conflict in Bosnia by using strategic bombing through NATO. And 1995 also shows us how scandal and celebrity status really coincides with the American people. And American people have a lust for scandal with the O.J. Simpson trial, one of these national trials that garnered so much attention, and a guy who's clearly guilty was found innocent. And there's all sorts of drama that goes into that. We see that even more 2 years later with the Lewinsky scandal in the White House. President Bill Clinton was accused of having relations with an intern and lied under oath about it. And that really created a stigma for Clinton that led to his impeachment. Now, he wasn't actually impeached by the Senate, only the House, but this kind of marred Clinton's presidency. And while all of that is going on, out in the Middle East, Osama bin Laden, a terrorist leader of a group called Al-Qaeda, issues what the Muslim faith calls a fatwa, which is basically a declaration of something. And in this case, it was a declaration of jihad against the West. And not a lot of people took this all that seriously. However, we do know that there will be something coming after that. Now, the U.S. remains involved in Kosovo, which was another one of these territories coming out of Yugoslavia, and along with NATO and the UN, try to end that conflict as well. In 2000, President Bush, the second one, is elected, and it's during his presidency that we do see the culmination of Al-Qaeda with the attacks on the World Trade Centers in New York City on 9/11. This incident is going to change the world forever because now the United States will not rest until it stops terrorism, which is exactly what President Bush declared, and then causes the U.S. to get involved throughout the Middle East as it's hunting for terrorists, in this case, Al-Qaeda. So we first see that in Afghanistan, where the U.S. ended up toppling a regime trying to track down and eradicate the Taliban. And that conflict lasts almost 10 years in the end, and there's not a lot of resolution from that. Meanwhile, in Israel, we have the Second Intifada, another example of conflict between the PLO and the people of Israel as well. It's in 2003 that as the U.S. continues to pursue Al-Qaeda and other Muslim terrorist groups, that they will invade Iraq and topple the regime of Saddam Hussein, the dictator who had been in power. Now, much of this was for oil, but it also created a new democratic type of government in Iraq as well, and the U.S. remained involved there as late as 2016. And finally, Hurricane Katrina hits in 2005, which leaves the United States kind of at a cross point because of everything that had been going on in the Middle East had put most of the U.S.'s attention over there. This brought it back home, and there was also a recession that followed this and a housing crisis. And that's not to say that Hurricane Katrina was the cause of that, but it did bring U.S. attention back home, which will be the attention of our next president, Barack Obama. Much of his presidency was focused on making changes in the United States to make it a little more economically stable and react to the fact that the United States had been so involved on world affairs. Now, that brings us to about 2010 or so. Obviously, we have a whole other decade of events there, but much of that is connected to the U.S. pursuing ISIS and other Islamic radical groups. But for the sake of AP World History, this gives us a great context to dive into the globalization of our world. Now, obviously, I didn't cover every single event, but this gives you a better picture of the context that we're overall looking for. That quick sprint through history from the 80s all the way up until 2010 or so definitely gives us some information, again, for context of the globalization of our world. It shows that things are becoming more and more connected, but it also shows us the overall conflict that's going on in our world, and that tensions, even after the Cold War, are still there. Billy Joel might have said it best in his song, "We Didn't Start the Fire," when he said, "We didn't start the fire. It's always been burning since the world's been turning. We didn't start the fire, though we didn't light it. We're trying to fight it." And that's truly what history is. All of these events are reactions to events in the past, and it's something that's been building since the dawn of time. And our generation today is stuck in a world that definitely reflects everything that happened before it. And so this fire that we didn't start is definitely something we're trying to deal with and even put out, but we know it's only going to keep burning as long as the world is turning. Thanks for watching.